still. And there is no voting nor election, so they don't have the problems that we have, I guess.
Yeah, worse.
Okay, so chapter 11, China. Just a little bit about China. The People's Republic of China remains the last great communism in the world. Not that it's the only one, it's just the biggest one, political system. Laos and North Korea are still practicing communism, and Cuba too. It's ruled by one political party, and that's communism. There is no election. We're going to talk about that. They have a president, and they have a party leader. The president is elected by the parliament members, basically, which they're all from one party, Communist Party. No election held in federal level, mixed economy of state-owned enterprises and privately held entities. We know that until 1970s, it was completely only everything, all the enterprises were held by the Communist Party, and then after 1970s, little by little, they started opening up, which you're going to talk about that after the leader Mao died, and then the other leader died too, so the person who took over started opening up little by little. That's how 1970s the change started, and then currently right now, a lot of enterprises in China are owned by government or private sector. So they have both basically enterprises. In China right now, currently, when I talk to my Chinese students, they always say that when the companies in China who look to be private entities and they're huge, they have some ties probably with Chinese government, like their board of directors or probably someone in Chinese government. There is no way that you're completely a private entity and you don't have anyone from the government of China. They're like, you guys know probably, you guys believe probably here it's all privately held, but in reality it's not. They have to have some ties to the Communist Party in order to become that big, the huge, big Chinese companies. It's a trading powerhouse of the world, and I didn't put these numbers here because in your book it's too old, so I wanted to make sure that I have the new numbers here for you. First of all, by area is the fourth. It says fifth because it comes Antarctica. That's why I was looking like, why is it fifth? And then I looked at it's Antarctica. The first one is Russia, Canada, United States, and China. China is just slightly, very small, little smaller than United States. We're going to talk about the history of China a lot too, but let's look into their numbers here. Now, GDP purchasing power parity, they're number one in the world. I don't know if you guys remember that we talked about GDP, PPP per purchasing power parity, and GDP nominal. Anybody remembers that one?
Mm-hmm. But I don't remember what.
So let's go to World Bank. You will see GDP. Here, you see 12 trillion is China by World Bank standards, right? Which is number two. The United States is 19 trillion. Now, when you go here, CIA basically says China is number one with 23 trillion and United States 19 trillion. So United States is the same here, 19 trillion, 19 trillion. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
Now why China is so different? Anybody remembers?
Everything's made up.
The calculation is different. Anybody remembers? I went through this actually 2 times throughout this semester. One was first week, and then the other one was, I think, third or fourth week. Okay, you see here it says GDP current US dollar. Okay? So here it says GDP purchasing power parity, this part. Okay? So when it says US dollar, how much is $1 US per when you convert it to yuan? Probably 6.89, something like that. US to yuan. 6.92, so it's going down. So when you calculate with the formula that World Bank is using per current US dollar, you are basically taking the whole amount and dividing by the number, by 6.92. You got it? By 6.92. When you divide it by 6.92,
Bless you.
because they're calculating
Bless you.
it
Bless you.
per US dollar, that's the reference point.
Bless you.
Excuse me, thank you. That's the reference point, right? The reference point basically says is US dollar. When you divided it to 6.92, of course it's gonna go down, right? But how CIA is calculating, they're calculating purchasing power parity. Do you guys remember the example of basket of goods and Big Mac, McDonald's Big Mac?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you can, for example, if you can buy a Big Mac here in the United States for $4, well, how much is pesos? I think it's, let's say 19, let's say $20, right? It's $20, 1 peso. In Mexico, if you go by US exact conversion, you have to buy 4 times 20, 100 basically pesos, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pesos, right? So now, in reality, in Mexico, it's not 80 pesos, it's, for example, 50 or 60 pesos.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it 50 or 60 pesos? Because purchasing power of people does not allow people to buy a burger every time for 80 pesos or 100 pesos, right? So they have to reduce it down for the purchasing power of people. So in that formula, in CIA's formula, it says then we say $4 equals to 50 pesos. Because with $4 here we buy a Big Mac,
Mhm.
over there with 50 pesos we buy a Big Mac, right? So it's not exact conversion. That's why the numbers are different. So here, if you go by purchasing power parity, actually China has passed United States by 3 trillion. But if you want to divide it exactly to US currency, then you have to divide it by 6.9. Now, the point is that Chinese currency, which is a very important area for United States policies, has always been to the attention of the administration. If you guys remember last administration, Obama has worked a lot towards encouraging China to increase their currency value. That means Obama said in reality, your currency does not equal 6 yuan, does not equal $1. It should be 2 yuan equal $1. Or even equal, 1 yuan equal $1, right? Why do we say that? Because it's based on supply and demand. If there is a demand for Chinese yuan, it should appreciate, right? It should become stronger. There is a lot of demand. It has a lot of volume of trade and investment, right? So there is demand for Chinese yuan. So it should appreciate. But the government superficially is keeping it low. They don't let it float based on supply and demand. Government superficially keeps it low. Why? For export purposes. If their currency becomes strong, we're not going to take our manufacturers over there if 1 yuan equals $1, right? So therefore, they're keeping it superficially, artificially, basically, they're keeping it low. Now, the government of the United States was not happy about it. They were pushing to make sure that it floats, free float, basically. It didn't happen. So think about this, if in reality they would let it float, $1 would be equal to 1 yuan, which the purchasing power would be really 23 trillion for both, for whether World Bank or this one. But because they're keeping it low, now you have to divide like 23 trillion by 6 or whatever. But their currency should be much stronger than what it is. Now, for the last 2 years, we have seen every single day this is going down. It's going, for last 2 years, it was 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, it was 6.5. And every single day it's going down little by little by little. From 6.5 to 6.9 now, which is losing its value. Now, per capita, let's look at per capita right now. China's per capita, it's 108 in the world. You see how it goes down when it comes to per capita? Tremendously. It was number one, purchasing power parity. How come it's now 108 when it comes to per capita? The same GDP. Anybody has any idea? You guys remember? No, because of the population. It's per capita. That means you have to divide by the population. The whole amount that you saw in the list, it must be divided to the population of the country. That's how you calculate per capita, right? Here. These are the total amounts. When you say per capita, that means you have to divide it to the population of the country. So you divide 23 trillion to 1.5 billion. That's why it goes so low. But United States is dividing by 328, I guess, million, right? So it brings the per capita up. Now, when you look into per capita, let me show you the per capita. Now look here, China is such a huge country and the per capita is 16. Brazil is 110, per capita 15,000. Now look here, small countries, look how small they are. You guys probably know half of it, right? Liechtenstein, Qatar, Monaco, Macau, which is part of China, Luxembourg, Bermuda, Singapore, all of these are very small countries. Why? Because when you divide by a very small population, it shows a huge per capita. So it's not a good indicator. Unfortunately, economists are using it all the time, but it's not a good indicator because it doesn't show the gap between poor and rich, and it doesn't show, because this income is not distributed equally, but it looks like it is distributed equally, right? Because it says each person has this amount. So Qatar for many years was number one. Now I see it's number two. But before Qatar was number one, Liechtenstein was always number one. So now it's taking over back again. And it's just because they're very small countries. FDI inflow. China has a huge FDI inflow. Foreign direct investment inflow. The money comes to your country, which is very good for the economy. That's why their GDP is going high, because of the money that comes into the economy. Inflow is always good for the economy. Outflow is not good for the economy. When we're importing everything from China, we're giving money out. So that's outflow. It's not really good. When we're investing in China, manufacturers, anything, we're taking money out of United States, so it's FDI outflow, and we're taking to China, which is FDI inflow for China, which is very good for their economy. One of the highest growth rate in the world for its size. You might actually see very small countries have like 50% or 100% of growth in 1 year, right? It's just because, it has happened in the history, it's just because their country is very small, it was completely ruined due to civil war or some form of instability, political instability, and then all of a sudden the war is done, United States or IMF or other countries help them invest over there, and then flips over immediately 1 year, right? It doesn't continue the same growth, of course. But it has happened in the past, in the history. But for the size of China, that was for the first time in the history 12%. Because the bigger the country is very difficult to have such a big jump. United States and other developed economies or stable economies, they usually have between 2 to 4% of growth, which is good enough. Hong Kong became part of China in 1997, just very recently because it was a colony of Britain. After 1945, Republic of China took control of Taiwan. Now, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau are the three special administrative regions of China. They are they're considered part of China by Chinese government. By Chinese government. However, those three countries, if you can call them countries, they don't consider themselves part of China, and they don't want to be part of China. You talk to Taiwanese, they say we're Taiwanese, and they'll be very offended if you call them Chinese. versus if you talk to Chinese, they say, what do you mean? Like, you're Chinese. They say, Taiwanese. So it's a huge conflict between Chinese and Taiwanese to basically say who's Chinese, who's Taiwanese. Yes?
And do they have different dialects?
They do. They speak different languages, just dialects, exactly. But their passports, Taiwanese passports, I've seen, one says, Chinese says Republic of China, and Taiwanese says People's Republic of China. So the passport, there's no Taiwanese passport. They don't have representation in the United Nations. So it's all under China. But they don't like it. And their economic system is more open, and was even more open before China opened up. So they had more trade with world before China started. And then when Hong Kong joined, Hong Kong kept its political system, which is an economic system too, which is more open. But there is a catch to it. It's for 50 years in their basically Constitution of China, when they added Hong Kong to China, it says for 50 years. So in 1947, we don't know what's going to happen to Hong Kong. What happened was that for 50 years, you can keep your economic and political system. That's what it was. So after that, we don't know if we have to join China as a political and economic system, because China is mixed, but that's more open market, or they're going to keep it that way. They're going to continue. Macau too. Macau is 50 years too. So from the joining time, they have a 50 years agreement. Towards the mid-century, we have to see what's going to happen to China. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the history of China. In 10th century, China was the world's leading economy in terms of per capita. So it was at one point in the world, around the world, that was only Roman Empire, Persian Empire, and Chinese dynasty. That's it. And in 10th century, China was the dominant power in the world. Europe was still in dark ages when China developed a civil service system. So China was way ahead of Europe. And they developed powder, road systems, and efficient system of public finance. Your book particularly says, although they developed gunpowder, they were not capable of developing the weapons, or weapons of mass destruction, I don't know. I truly don't believe in that, but if the author wants to believe in it, then that's fine with the author. I don't believe that they were not capable of its ideology too, rather than being capable. I mean, you can develop gunpowder, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to create mass destruction, weapon of mass destruction. It performed Europe in levels of technology, outperformed. Between 1500 and 1800, Europe gradually took over China. In 1820, China had the highest level of real GDP in the world. Its GDP was 199 billion compared to 21 billion of Japan, 31 billion for England, and 12 billion for the United States. China's population at that time was 381 million. Even at that time was huge, the population. China came in 1900 with the Boxer Rebellion, which led into our military intervention by international army consisting of troops from US, England, Germany, France, and Japan. So 1900, China saw a lot of invasions by Chinese, by Japanese, by France, by later on in the century, Russia. So they went through a lot of invasions. And that's why in communist time, they were very, very poor under Soviet Union's rule, and then eventually they picked up in 1970s. Chinese were defeated in all of those invasions. Economic territories were controlled by American, British, French, Germans, and Japanese. Chaos dominated in China. In 1911, Manchu dynasty was overthrown, led to long revolution in China. So 20th century, 1900 was not very good for China. Japan took advantage of the situation and invaded China in 1937. When I went to China about 15 years ago, in my group but that's 15 years ago though. Right now, that has been a little bit forgotten more. because 15 years ago, China just opened up, so a lot of people could go still for the first time to China and see it. And in my group, there was a Japanese girl. She never said she's from Japan. She was scared. She was like, I'm scared to say it still, because it was just opened up, and the housing still was honestly under like a housing system kind of thing in communist China. So people were not very open, so she wouldn't tell that she's Japanese. But right now you will see that that has completely changed because of the visitation and tourists and everything.
I'm sorry, where were you?
China.
Oh,
China. Japan took advantage of the situation and invaded China in 1937. Japan seized Formosa, which is current Taiwan, from Chinese at that time. After Japanese defeat of World War II, the two countries fought over the country, basically over the Taiwan. Development of economic system. Now it's going to talk about after World War II. So it was always world power, highest GDP, and then the first half of the 1900s, 20th century, they were defeated multiple times, invaded multiple times, and then after World War II, now this is after World War II, which Soviet Union is going to basically take over, by ideologically, not basically invasion. On October 1st, 1949, Communist China was formed. This is right after World War II. Masses were illiterate and had to be educated and trained. Fundamental changes in property rights, because a lot of properties were owned still by private sector. So they wanted to make it communist, so they had to take over. That's why a lot of changes were needed. Increase in military expenditures and on heavy industries. This was the ideology of the Soviet Union. So you have to focus on military and heavy industries, which eventually, we're going to talk about it, China didn't follow that. Because Russia was only focused on one area because of competition with the United States in military power. China started following the Soviet Union, but and then after a couple decades, they started slowing down and focusing on other industries as well. Common currency came into use called renminbi, meaning people's currency. Right now, still, they call it renminbi, which is yuan. Like their currency is yuan. When you want to say 1, 2, 3, you say yuan. But when you want to talk in general about money, their money, you say renminbi. In 1951 and 1952, the government took over all foreign-owned businesses. In 52 and 53, took over private enterprises. Now, if you remember, in communist era of Russia, as well as Soviet Union, as well as Eastern Bloc, when we talked about Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, they all had 5-year plans. That was the basically system coming from Soviet Union. They always had to have 5 years plan. When you have 5 years plan, you do this in 5 years, and then the second 5 years, and third 5 years. Soviet Union implemented this one for all those countries following communist ideologies. Implementing Soviet techniques. Soviet techniques were imported to develop the plant and run factories. They actually brought a lot of technicians and experts from Soviet Union. Soviet Union sent their engineers and technicians, exported basically to China, so they can train them, because Chinese people were not as educated as the Soviet, as Russian at the time. So they sent a lot of their people over there to China to educate them, to train them, especially about heavy industries. Which, again, in the 70s, China didn't follow, and sent those technicians back. Soviet agreed to aid in expanding electric power plants, supplying agriculture, mining, and chemical equipment. Soviet offered low-interest financial aid. Many organizational changes must have followed after the land reforms of 1949 and 52. 57, collectivization of farms took place. Do you guys remember collectivization of farms, which was left a little bit in Russia, in Soviet Union? Do you remember we said that the Soviet Union took all the lands, were agriculture lands. Some form of agriculture lands was left for people in collectivization forms. Do you guys remember what it was? It's not by government, it's not private. It's a group of people, let's say one small city, one town. They are all basically are responsible for the development for this agriculture property and all that. That's what it's called, collectivization. As a collective for the whole city or town, whatever it is, or group of people. So That's what they did too. They also followed Soviet collectivization system. Now the second 5-year plan, in 1958, Chinese departed from the pattern of economic development in the first 5-year plan, focused on Great Leap Forward, which was, Great Leap Forward says, focus, what do you have the best? China believe that they have a lot of human power. So let's focus on our labor power. They shifted completely all the focus on labor, which was basically whatever people can produce, we're gonna focus on that one, so they produce it. Soviet Union was not happy about this because Soviet Union wanted to make sure that they train experts, right? So therefore, they had a little, that was the start of a little bit of conflict, which Soviet wanted to make sure they discontinue the form of Great Leap Forward, but China didn't want to. They wanted to focus on their people. The enormous population was regarded as an economic asset, so they focused on their population. Agriculture, communal organization, which was the last stage of the confiscation of any private agriculture property. There are two types of government ownership when they take private properties. One is confiscation, one is expropriation. Confiscation is when government takes your property over and does not pay anything in return. Expropriation is that government does pay some basically incentives back. Could be anything. Could be bonds, could be cash value, anything. They pay some back. So here it was confiscation, meaning they don't pay anything back. Sometimes when they take the asset of foreign governments, sometimes it's in the form of expropriation, right? A good example is Cuba. When Cuba in 1961 took American land over in Cuba, because the United States government had a huge sugar land in Cuba. So what happened was Cuban government, as soon as they became communist, they took over, and in return, they didn't want to call it confiscation, so they called it expropriation, and they offered United States government Cuban bonds, okay, government bonds. And United States was basically claiming that we call it confiscation because the amount paid was so ridiculous that we better call it confiscation rather than expropriation, because that bond worth nothing, right, compared to that land. But Cuba, still up to today, they say it was expropriation because we did give you something, you just didn't want it. Now, the industries, as far as industries, communists emphasize on the large workers, as we said, Great Leap Forward, and